Hey everyone! Before we open today's file, please make sure to follow us on Instagram at d.s.radio, where you can find all the images that go along with today's case. You can drop us an email at contact.dsradio@gmail.com. You can find all of our socials in the Linktree bio on our Instagram profile, including links to merch. If you're feeling especially generous, you can join our Patreon at patreon.com/dystopian simulation radio, where you can get access to our exclusive Instagram page and make suggestions for upcoming episode topics that you would like us to cover. Speaking of Patreon, thanks to our Patreons, Riff Cult, Cropley Crab, Cash Broadus, Raspberry Jr., Jason R. Nelson, Creepy Paper, Jamie Sook, Michael Laughlin, Lindsay Keller, Mike Wright, Greer Weaver, Kelsey Carruthers, Linz Gibbon, Drake Holvig, Only Child, Michael M, Wesley Akers, Riaz K, Emily Medeiros, Pip, Heather Wynn, Graves, Devon Sweatshirt, The Ordained Sinister Minister, and Philip Hoffman. Hey everyone, and welcome to Dystopian Simulation Radio, and happy Halloween!
Happy Halloween!
That was actually genuinely scary. That's not what I expected to come through my headphones. So Chris, what are you doing for Halloween?
For Halloween, I am dressing up my small human in amusing costumes, and yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all I got planned.
Oh. I'll probably do a seance.
Same energy.
Yeah, pretty much. Before we get into the episode today, we should mention that we did a watch-along with Jordan from the Nighttime podcast.
We did, and it's still up, isn't it? It wasn't just a live stream, it was like...
No, it's staying up there, I think.
Staying up there. So it's over on Jordan's YouTube channel, right?
Yep, exactly. Nighttime podcast. So you can probably search that, find his YouTube channel. And we watched The Video Dead, I think it was called.
Yeah. So if you're listening to this way, way in the future, and you go there and you're like, there's too many videos, just search for The Video Dead Nighttime podcast and it should come up.
Yeah. Watch Along, I think he titled it as well. And it was a very interesting zombie movie from the 80s. That's all I'm going to say. If you haven't seen it, watch along with us maybe.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a watch, I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I'm glad I can add that to the list of weird shit that I've watched in my life. If you want to see any visuals that go along with this episode, you can do so at Instagram at d.s.radio. That's where we always put visuals.
Yeah, if you're feeling especially generous, you can head over to our Patreon page, which is patreon.com/dystopian simulation radio, and show a little support for the podcast. Anything that you can do is greatly appreciated to keep the costs of hosting and so on going.
Yes. Chris.
Yes.
Newcastle. It's a wonderful place. But has it always been? But has it always been, Chris? Not really. Especially if you happen to be an elderly and unattractive spinster with a pet cat or dog on bad terms with your neighbour in the 1600s.
Oh, this is getting real now.
So listeners, Chris and I are from the city of Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK, and today's sinister story is local to us. But before we proceed, Chris, if you would kindly provide the listeners with a brief summary of Newcastle.
Of course. Newcastle upon Tyne. Once the edge of an empire, now simply sting and sausage rolls. Newcastle is located in the northeast of England and is the last major city before you reach Scotland. Founded in the 2nd century BC on the site of a Roman settlement, Newcastle, and the surrounding area was literally the end of the world, at least for the Roman Empire. That's where they constructed Hadrian's Wall, the inspiration for the Wall of Ice in Game of Thrones, to keep the Scots out. Now, times have certainly changed, as most Scots wouldn't want to enter England if you paid them now, but at one point we did have Little Chef. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Newcastle did nothing for quite a bit until becoming the centre of shipbuilding for the British Empire and one of the top coal mining areas in the country. Flash forward to the 1980s, and there is little of the empire left, and Thatcher closed all the mines. So once again, Newcastle sat around and did nothing for a few years, until recently, where it's reinvented itself as the party capital of Europe, until we left it, and as the site of some major museums. Newcastle is most famous for stotties, which is a flat bread that you can fill up with all kinds of food, Greg's pasties, brown ale, which is now made by Anheuser-Busch, who make Budweiser, and Geordies, both a people and a dialect. The most famous Geordies include Master of Tantric Sex, Sting, footballer turned amateur terrorist negotiator, Gaza, and 1/3 of the current AEW Trios champions, the Bastard Pack.
Thank you, Chris, for that enlightening historical and geographical account of our beloved city.
So for anybody who doesn't know who Gaza is and what I'm talking about, so I guess it probably must be about 15 years ago, there was a rather unfortunate incident with somebody in the local area taking some hostages with a gun, and this footballer Gaza, who fell into disgrace really for being, he was incredibly talented. I think he was on the England squad and so on, but essentially he let his demons get the better of him in terms of alcoholism, and has really fallen far from grace. And his lowest point was turning up to the site of the hostage incident with, I believe it was a 6-pack and some KFC, and insisting that he knew the guy who was there holding the hostages and that he could defuse the situation. He didn't.
And that's all there really is to say about that situation. He didn't.
He didn't. No.
No.
But yeah, so Newcastle, it's a lovely city. It's here. It has been here for a long time, and presumably will continue to be here for some time more.
Thank you, Chris. That was beautiful. And actually, you really summed it up in a short while, so kind of impressed. I honestly thought you would just be like jokes on top of jokes, but you actually gave some real history. Thank you. That actually helps.
There, I mean, I do make a lot of jokes at Newcastle's expense, but that's British humour. We like to be self-deprecating. I mean, look at our government. But Newcastle, it's full of history. It's a wonderful place to visit. And North's always better than the South, isn't it?
Well, everyone knows that. But Chris.
Yes.
You might learn. Maybe you already know the story. Maybe you don't. But you're going to learn something extra today about our city of Newcastle. Ooh. For this is the story of the Newcastle Witch-Finders.
Ooh. So where can one find a witch?
Well, when we think of witches, we usually think of the Salem witch trials, which unfolded in colonial Massachusetts from February 1692 to May 1693. The Salem trials saw 19 of 200 accused of being witches hanged. During these trials, the accused were marched before courts who used the following methods to determine if the accusation was warranted by either confession, testimony from 2 eyewitnesses to the acts of witchcraft, or spectral evidence.
Okay, so just before we get into that, because obviously there's a very important point to ask about there, spectral evidence. So I do think of the Salem witch trials, but that's more from like popular culture and things. I mean, I tend to think of what we did over here with our own witch trials a little bit earlier than that, I think, where we dunk unfortunate people in water and leave them underwater for some time, and where essentially we'd throw you in a big lake, and if you floated, you were a witch, and if you died, well, I guess you weren't a witch, but
exactly. It's a really fair test.
Yes.
spectral evidence. Do you know what that is, Chris?
No, but it sounds very difficult to prove, which I'm guessing is the point.
Exactly. So the Salem Witch Museum has you covered for this definition, and they write, spectral evidence refers to a witness testimony that the accused person's spirit or spectral shape appeared to him or her in a dream at the time of the accused person's physical body was at a totally different location.
So
it cannot be proved.
If I have a dream of you eating ice cream in Beirut, that proves that you're in Beirut spectrally.
And I'm a witch.
You heard it here first, folks. Confess.
Well, I actually do share a trait, a very strange trait with witches, but we'll get to that later. And
okay.
It's a short story, but it's kind of strange. But anyway. So, once accused, tests would be performed on a quote-unquote witch, including seeing if the accused would, as you said earlier, Chris, sink or float when bound and thrown into a body of water. So, like you said, floating indicated that the accused was a witch, and sinking indicated the accused was human, but sadly they would also die. So, lose-lose situation, to be honest.
At least she cleared her name.
And that's exactly what they thought. They're like, oh, well, she's with God now. It's just like, yeah, technically this is a murder, but we'll skip over that, I suppose.
You win some, you lose some.
So other tests included having the accused say the Lord's Prayer, assuming that a child of Satan could not, and locating witch marks, which were said to be blemishes or marks on the body of a witch that would appear after making a pact with the devil.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, unfortunately...
Like who doesn't have some kind of blemish on their body, though?
Exactly. So unfortunately, there were many markings that would count as a witch's mark if found on the body of the accused, including birthmarks, scars, moles, and general abrasions.
So if you have the unfortunate luck to bash your knee off a table earlier in the day, that is a general abrasion that proves you as a witch.
Well, it definitely goes against you at trial. And do you have a birthmark or a freckle or anything, a mole, anything that is not just pure skin?
I've got a birthmark on my, I don't know which shoulder it is, if it's on the back, but one of them. And I've got, a general amount of freckles. I've got 3 that form into a triangle, though, on my arm.
I think you know what that means, Chris. You
Alien abduction.
Or a wizard. So these marks were believed to be placed on the victim by the devil himself, by either scratching the witch's skin, licking the skin, or branding them at the end of an initiation rite where a witch would be pledged onto him. The marks were also immune to pain, and they would not bleed when pricked, which also became a kind of method or test to determine if someone was a witch.
If thou'st prick a witch, does it not bleed?
Doth it bleed not? Well, people were so afraid of having markings on their bodies that could lead them to being accused of being a witch or work against them if they were ever tried. So they would actually attempt to cut off or burn off any moles, birthmarks, or blemishes. However, unfortunately for them, exactly, the wounds or the scars left behind would also be considered witch marks under the right circumstances. So everyone was
got like a branding, like a cattle branding that said 100% not a witch.
Then they'd be like, that's exactly what a witch would say. So, Chris, pricking, as it was called, was also a form of testing for a witch, which involved pricking the skin of the accused with a needle or pin to see if they bled or not. Witches, it was said, did not bleed, as the devil himself had drained them of all blood, oftentimes from a witch's teat, which is essentially a third nipple. So Harry Styles, Mark Wahlberg, and Zac Efron, you're not fooling any of us.
Does Harry Styles have a nubbin?
Harry Styles, I think he has like 4 nipples. He has like more than 3. And look, he's wildly successful. He's very handsome. He's got it all.
He spends a lot of time shirtless, doesn't he?
Yeah, but he just rocks the witch's teats.
The witch's teats. That boy's got them witching teats.
That could be why we're all like, oh, Harry Styles, or like so many people love him. He's got the
bewitched
witch's
by-
teeth. Yeah, he's bewitched us all. So, Chris, today we are going to be talking about a witch finder who came over the border from Scotland to Newcastle to administer these dubious tests on women of Northumberland who were unlucky enough to be accused of witchcraft. The Newcastle witch trials actually happened in 1649, so decades before the infamous Salem witch trials in the US, as you said earlier. All right, a little bit of history here, so bear with me. The Newcastle witch trials came hot off the heels of religious and political turmoil that resulted after the Scottish army was defeated in the Second English Civil War, and the Kirk Party, who were like a radical Presbyterian faction of the Scottish Covenanters, rose to power in Scotland and instilled a God-fearing mentality over the people. They became particularly interested in ridding the east coast of Scotland from witches, relying on the community to out them, and employing witch finders to test and condemn them, usually to a hanging death after torture and public humiliation. The Kirk Party passed a Witchcraft Act in 1649, encouraging people to root out witches from their communities. And this is said to be where the whole witch hunting madness really kicked off. Witch hunts eventually migrated down to Northumberland, including Newcastle, and Newcastle Council actually decided to hire a witch finder to come and weed out witches in the local area.
As you do. I must admit, occasionally I thought, well, council jobs are well paid. And I've taken a bit of a look on the website, but I've never once seen a witch finder general.
I mean, if that was a job, I feel like you might apply for it, Chris.
I think I probably would. I'd be quite good at it. 100% success rate. I pricked him and he bled.
No, you have to not bleed.
Oh, shit.
Or, I guess, yeah, they'd have to not bleed because you'd have to be finding them as a witch finder. You'd have to get some non-bleeders. You could round up Harry Styles.
Say no more. Come with me, Mr. Styles.
So witches were a genuine fear to people in the 1600s. It was a generally grim period, rife with political and religious turmoil, diseases that spread mercilessly without cure, which in turn led to these weird superstitious beliefs, including the idea that illness and famine was the result of curses, spells, or hexes cast by witches.
I wonder if witches are going to make a comeback.
They might, I mean, I
current.
don't. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to mention what group I'm talking about, but there is a group that's kind of rose up in the past 4 years that have very superstitious beliefs and fear many things. Let's skip over that for now, though. So during the 1600s, what we now call Newcastle upon Tyne was then known as Newcastle of Northumberland, and it was even absorbed into and recognised as being part of Scotland for a stint, which explains our DNA results that we got back from Ancestry, Chris.
Yeah.
It is believed that the witch hunting trials began in Inverkeithing, a port town and parish in Fife, Scotland. And Walter Bruce was a minister at the Scottish parish of Inverkeithing who was known to give unnerving and graphically descriptive sermons on witches, including their clandestine presence amongst the general population and the disturbing deeds that they committed, ranging from getting freaky with the Dark Lord, chomping on babies, striking down cattle. Mixed bag of fun and games, if you will.
Sounds like my kind of party.
Walter Bruce was so obsessed with witch hunting that he neglected his duties as a minister to pursue his passion. So figures like Bruce inspired fear in an already superstitious population, and he became the main player in this whole witch hunting debacle of 1649. It's not really known what inspired his obsession with witches, but some say it came from the French, as Scotland and France were close back in the mid-1600s, and the French had these insane beliefs about witches like existing in the population, and they would like trial and torture them outside of regular jurisdiction and force them to confess because they believed that you had to be harsher on a witch because they could manipulate judges with their powers and whatnot.
Ooh.
So where does Newcastle come into this? I hear you asking, Chris.
Where does Newcastle come into this?
Well, concerned that Geordie witches had camouflaged themselves into the city and surrounding areas, Newcastle Council unleashed their largest lunged town crier onto the streets to call for members of the community to snitch on a witch or people they believed to be witches, like neighbours or whoever. What kind of people do you think were getting turned over to the town crier and the council?
Oh, anybody that you didn't like. I would say probably, you don't like your co-worker. I think he might be a witch. You don't like your next door neighbour. She's definitely a witch.
I can think of a few people I'd turn over, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, that's how those things start, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's the same in during Nazi Germany and so on. Turning people in who were undesirable for whatever reason. It kind of weaponizes people, weaponizes children against parents and everything. That sort of thing. It's that fear that's stoked. So. Really, somebody who is savvy about it can weaponize that and can make an enemy into a witch.
Yeah.
And if you're the first person to sling the mud, then maybe you can get away with it.
Yeah, and imagine somebody had something that you wanted. Like, your next of kin was set to inherit some land and you knew that you'd never live to own it. And you could be like, well, my older brother here, he's a bit of a character.
Uncle Boris is one of those new-fashioned outdoor toilets. I wouldn't mind if I do.
Hundreds were executed in Scotland for crimes of witchcraft, and Newcastle would narrow down their accused persons to 30, 28 of which died. So although significantly less than Scotland, this would come to be known as pretty much the last hardcore witch hunt in England's history. So of the 30 women accused of being witches, a few did reportedly confess to being in league with the devil. But as you can imagine, that was probably through torture.
Yeah, it's quite an effective way of getting people to confess things that they didn't actually do.
Yeah, it's like, no, I'm not a witch, no, I'm not a witch. And then a couple of days later, they're suddenly a witch. And they look a lot worse for wear. Weird how that happens. Of the 30 witches, or so-called witches, rounded up by the council, 28 died as a result of torture, starvation, or suicide. Although torture was illegal in England at the time, the accused would essentially be tortured into confession. One recorded torture, and this is really horrible, one recorded torture described a man being walked over broken bricks with bare feet until his bones protruded through the skin.
Ugh.
The man is identified in documents as Matthew Bulmer, although sometimes Matthew Bonner, and he was a Newcastle man accused of shape-shifting into a black cat and luring away children to kill them as part of a ritual sacrifice to the devil.
Oh,
He
probably
suffered...
got what he deserved then, didn't he?
He wasn't actually doing it, Chris.
Oh, sorry. I thought this was proven.
He suffered this torture for a total of 24 hours, and he was forced to walk barefoot over the broken brick that was spread across the ground while being dragged in circles by a mule in the basement of the jail in Newcastle Keep.
Oh.
So if you're from Newcastle, you'll definitely be familiar with Newcastle Keep, as you probably went there with school at some point. According to records, Matthew Bulmer was eventually hanged and burnt in Newcastle for crimes of wizardry and shape-shifting.
Oh, so he was tried as a wizard, not a
Yeah.
witch.
But yeah, they classed it as the same thing. But wizardry, I don't know why, it just sounds kind of funny. Although it's a horrific thing. But when it's like crimes of wizardry, it's like, you just think of like Merlin or something.
Yeah, I always thought, because people say, well, what's the male version of a witch?
Warlock, I thought.
Yeah, I thought warlock
Yeah.
as well. But, as well, men can be witches as well. But
Well, I think a male witch back in these old records was wizard. Which...
Okay, it's a different, I suppose it's an evolution of the idea, but isn't it? Because now witches and wizards are totally different. You think of wizards as like men with long wispy beards and tall hats who are sort of
Not
almost
exactly
like
sinister.
No,
Yeah.
like almost like alchemists.
Yeah.
But witches, you think of, sitting around a big cauldron on Hampstead Heath or whatever, going, "Eye of Newton, tail
Yeah.
of squirrel."
I think that's Shakespeare's fault, isn't it?
Yeah.
When I think witch, sometimes I just think of like pagans or something, like having some festivals with weird masks and such.
Well, like Wicker Man style.
Yeah, like lemon parties. If you don't know what that is, don't look it up.
Search it.
Don't search for it.
But are you talking sort of like Wicker Man Like the original or the Nicolas Cage?
The original, of course.
No bees involved.
No bees. But back to the historical account of witches, there was no bees, but they did whip the accused, burn their heads, palms, and the soles of their feet with candles while they hung from ropes by their thumbs. They would also be sexually assaulted and beaten while being held in jail awaiting trial. So horrific treatment and tortures for simply being accused of witchcraft before they even made it to trial, just to force them to confess. So once you're accused, you basically had no chance.
Yeah, and like, was this like? I'm assuming that this type of torture and confession extraction was specific to witchcraft.
Exactly, it was illegal technically, but when it came to witches, they just ignored it all because of obviously this Bruce guy. He basically said you have to be harder on them than a regular person, but they were regular people. So they basically they weren't given any kind of human rights, I guess. I mean, they did have some rules at the time, even though it was the 1600s. They did have rules that you weren't supposed to torture people into confession, but that didn't count for witches, which is awful. So an accusation was basically a death warrant.
Yeah, and like I said, you can weaponize that real easy.
And they did. 15 of the accused were hanged on the town moor.
Oh.
Yeah, so 14 women accused of being witches were hanged, and one man accused of being a wizard or a warlock or whatever we want to refer to them as.
Now, I mean, we know the town moor for having a couple of sporadic cows on it and being the site of a amusement park every year, isn't it?
Yeah, like a festival.
Yeah. So just think, if you're from the Newcastle area, next time you're riding the teacups, somebody was hanged there.
Yeah. I mean, if you're from Newcastle, this is very interesting. Or if you're going to visit or you have visited, like, these are all sites that you'll just see around, like the town moor, the castle keep, and, as we'll get into later, if you've ever been to the Korean supermarket and the church across the street, that's also going to be another location. So in Scotland and Newcastle, the most popular form of checking if someone was a witch or not was, as we said, the practice of pricking. They would basically, and this is horrible, especially if you're a woman back then, they would strip the accused person pretty much naked or, above or below the waist, and they would just prick them. They'd either prick a devil mark on their skin to see if they bled or not, or just generally like the thigh or something. So if they didn't bleed, they were a witch. They were actual professional prickers, professional pricks, if you will.
I know a few of those.
Yeah, same. Who were hired to go around pricking the accused people. And these prickers would be paid handsomely for every witch they identified. It's very easy to see that there's an incentive to find witches when you get like 20 shillings per head, which I'm not sure if this is correct, but I read that could be around £100 per witch in today's value.
Yeah, you'd be seeing witches everywhere, wouldn't you?
Exactly.
I mean, that answers my question, because I was thinking these must be pretty awful prickers if they're not managing to draw blood on this.
Exactly.
Sure...
So you have an incentive to go prick witch, but you have to do that. You have to make them not bleed somehow, don't you?
Interesting.
Yes. So a Scottish pricker who remains officially unnamed and mysterious. Well, there is sort of names out there, but they're not on record. So I'm going to go with unnamed and mysterious for lack of a source, basically. So this Scottish pricker was paid to travel down to Newcastle and, well, get pricking the 30 accused people that had been wrangled up by Newcastle Council at the behest of suspicious neighbours, or let's be frank, those who were unfortunate enough to have enemies or be aged and ugly. By the way, that was another characteristic. If they were old and ugly and a woman, a witch. So these people...
Hell, must
I know.
Been like coming to Disneyland in Newcastle then.
You're awful. So they were forced to endure a humiliating ordeal in a small court on what we now know as the Quayside in Newcastle that overlooks the River Tyne. So in that small court, the location of which is believed to be where there now stands a J.D. Wetherspoon's pub, which still has exposed beams and stone walls on display.
I didn't think it could get any worse for speaking of Wetherspoons.
Exactly. A group of men would lift up the accused women's dresses against their will and push a needle into their thighs. But if you're a witch picker getting 20 shillings per head, you are motivated to find witches where there aren't witches, so you can get that bread, right? Rise and grind, bitch. It's pricking time. So in order to profit to the maximum degree, this mysterious Scottish witch picker had a 95+% success rate at finding witches and torturing them to confess, or using sleight of hand to pretend that they pricked them with a needle. Some also say that the needle device retracted, so they would prick them, quote unquote, but the needle would go back inside the device, and then they would announce, "She doth not bleed," and there you have a witch and 20 shillings.
I mean, to be fair, I'm down with this. I could do this job.
You're awful. Just killing euthanizing old people for 100 quid a pop.
Well, you know. You wouldn't actually be euthanizing them. You'd just be doing the pricking.
Well, you would be torturing them sometimes. You would be like the captain of the ship in the witch executing department, I guess. Giving orders.
Overtime for that.
For extra prickings. So another technique the witch pricker relied on was that the accused woman would reportedly be so mortified from being exposed and naked before a court of men that the blood would rush directly to her face, so when pricked at the thigh with a pin, she wouldn't be as fast to bleed. I don't know how accurate that is. I still think you bleed no matter how embarrassed you are.
That sounds like the logic of somebody who doesn't understand anatomy.
Yes, and that is probably why it's in this research. So an English lieutenant named Hobson, who was switched out to replace the judge halfway through the trials of these 30 accused, he noticed this, and when he spoke up, the witch finders, of which there was reportedly 3 in the court, couldn't argue against him. He said, "Try again, like prick these ladies' thighs again, let's see." He just didn't believe that they wouldn't bleed. And the witch prickers couldn't really argue against it, because when they would try again, the lady would bleed. So it was obvious that they were tricking in some way. So aside from witch pricking, there was different styles of dunking a witch. If the pricking thing was too hard and you weren't a good magician, you weren't good at sleight of hand, you could just dunk them, right? I mean, foolproof. There's no military colonels with medical experience coming up and going, "Oh, would try it again." Once you dunk them, they're dunked. Witches could be dunked into a body of water while strapped to like a specifically designed dunking chair, which was a wooden chair attached to a long wooden beam, kind of like a massive spoon or utensil. And there are records of this happening at a pond in Washington, in Tyne and Weir.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And at least 3 people were reportedly killed this way. So another method was much the same, only without the dunking chair. So a witch would have her thumbs tied to her toes in a hunched position, and she would just be, boop, pushed into water. This was actually classed as a form of torture rather than a method of execution. So, as you can imagine, it's not really a form of torture, it's literally killing somebody.
Yeah. I mean, like I said before, it's a very interesting way of torturing, or of casting a judgment, in the fact that the only way to prove yourself innocent is by death.
I know, I just can't understand how that flew with anyone. They must have been in such a state of fear that they were just willing to go along with anything. Because if you think of this was a literal witch hunt inspired by God, by people who were Christians, by people who, love thy neighbour kind of went out of the window in the mid-1600s in Newcastle.
It's kind of interesting, the relationship. I mean, do you know what sect of the church Bruce was?
Radical Presbyterian faction.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Because it's funny the relationship that the church has with the occult. Because it seems at different times that serve different purposes within it. And one of the biggest things was these witch hunts, obviously. But as well, even through to the modern day, there are still priests that do exorcisms, for example. So it's
well, that's a Catholic thing, I guess. Well, and Catholics tend to be a bit more spooky.
That's why I was asking if we knew what kind of denomination he was.
Yeah.
Because I was going to say if it was Catholic. Quite interesting, because it still even kind of continues today to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how common exorcisms are, but I'm
That
going to say
could be an episode for the future.
I'm going to throw out ballpark. Every Catholic priest does at least one a year.
Do you think so? I don't think every Catholic priest has done an exorcism.
I don't know. I reckon they're like, they're like baptisms.
I would guess there's like a maximum of 10 per year. But then again, if you think of like other countries, they don't really tend to keep that many records. They just kind of...
I believe if it's the Catholic Church, in order to do an exorcism, in order to perform an exorcism,
do the exorcism. It's like a weird old dance.
do the exorcism. Put your foot to the left and put it right back in.
Crack your back.
Crack your back.
Spin
and now
your head.
Ectoplasm everywhere. But I think it's relatively accurate in the movie The Exorcist, where they have to go to literally to
the bureaucratic process of getting the exorcism approved.
It has to go all the way up to the top in the Vatican, I believe, to get approved. I don't think that they want Catholic priests just running around
exorcising demons willy-nilly.
Yeah. And if you're a Catholic priest and you're listening to this and you've done an exorcism, please get in touch. We'd love to hear about that.
We would. Oh, also, Chris doesn't know about this yet, but we will have a line that you can call into and leave messages or stories of your experiences for the show. So look out for that on the Instagram.
Ooh, so if people have been condemned as a witch or anything that they wanted to, they can leave us a lovely little voice message.
They can. So Chris, we have a list of those who lost their lives at the Newcastle witch trials. If you could read them out for us.
Of course. Matthew Bonner, executed for wizardry and shape-shifting. Miss Elizabeth Anderson, hung for witchcraft. Matthew Bulmer, hanged and burnt. Isaac Brown, hung for witchcraft. Anne Watson, hung for witchcraft and using her magic, with a K, to have her wicked way with a lord. Anne. Jane Hunter, hung for witchcraft. Jane Coupling, hung for witchcraft. Margaret Brown, hung for witchcraft. Margaret Mortiff, hung for witchcraft. I'm seeing a pattern here.
Yep.
Eleanor Anderson, accused of witchcraft. Okay, so she didn't die.
Well, I think she did die, but maybe it was like, the torture or suicide or starved or something, as we read earlier.
She was accused so hard she died.
Well, yeah, that's pretty much what happened to all of them.
Eleanor Rogers, hung for witchcraft. Elspeth Dobson, hung for witchcraft. Eleanor Robson, hung for witchcraft and bloodletting. And Margaret Madison, hung for witchcraft. All of which on Newcastle Town Moor, 1649.
And can I just point out the one where, they said that some lady bewitched a lord to sleep with her?
Yeah.
Come on.
That sounds like somebody got caught with his pants down and was like,
She's a witch.
She's a witch.
Exactly. Come on. That is so ridiculous. When I read that, I was cringing super hard. Really? Really?
Yeah. What an excuse, though.
I know, oh, it's not me. She bewitched me. She's a witch. But I guess, I don't know, maybe out of sheer embarrassment, the wife maybe went along with it. Oh yeah, that's what happened. He's not just an absolute dog.
Yeah,
that woman is a witch.
I'm trying to think of the scenarios. Yeah, I guess she would lose. At the time, if you did get a divorce, she'd probably lose any claim to.
Oh, there's no way she'd divorce him. It was probably an embarrassment thing and sort of. Yeah. For him, for reputation as well.
That's what I mean. She probably did it more for herself, though, because unless this lewd act was taking place in public, nobody else would know.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying. I wonder what the story is behind that, actually. I'd love to know, each individual story. So, Chris, the last name on the list there, Margaret Madison, turned up a very interesting article from the Newcastle Weekly Chronicle, published on 29th of March, 1873, so a long time after, titled The Misery of Margaret Madison, A Tale of the Tyne. Now, we don't usually do long-form story readings here at DSR, however, this article was so interesting And there was such a window into what it was like for someone who was accused of witchcraft back then, and I really wanted to share it. But we'll do this at the end of the episode, so everyone can just sit back this Halloween and listen to a really horrifying tale of what it would have been like to be one of these women who was executed after being accused of being a witch. But we'll get to that at the end. So I want to finish this episode, Chris, with the witches. Where are they now? Apparently, the remains of the witches are said to be buried in St. Andrew's Churchyard in Newgate Street in Newcastle upon Tyne. So opposite the Korean supermarket, or the Asian supermarket in Newgate.
Oh,
next to the gate.
Yeah. I know it very, very well.
Exactly. So they're supposed to be buried there, but some say that it was in like a big unmarked grave. In January of 2008, the remains, or some remains, began to surface. So teeth, ribs, and skull fragments kind of made their way to the top of the soil and protruded out. According to an article in the Chronicle that same month, Bill Atkinson, who was the church caretaker at the time, described how one of the workers who handled a skull fragment developed sores and scabs on his skin afterwards, leading people to fear the remains were cursed.
Or he's just got terrible hygiene protocols.
He did not wash his hands. So we have a little quote from Bill that you can read to the people, Chris.
I told Jim not to lick it. We had lights put up around the church, and they dug a ditch and found bits of skulls and bones. One of the guys who was working on the ditch picked up a piece of skull and excitedly showed it to everyone. There is no way I would touch any of them. The next day he had sores and scabs on his arms. He went to the doctors and he didn't know what it was. Every time it rains, it washes the soil away and more bones come to the surface.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's I've been to the killing fields in Cambodia, and it's much the same sort of thing, but on a much bigger scale. You have to be very careful where you walk because constantly bones, teeth, and fragments are coming up through the soil, and there's just sort of piles of them lying around, not for lack of care, just because they need to all be processed. So, rain plays a really significant part, and over time, especially if bodies are buried in a shallow grave, they will rise up to the surface.
Yeah. I remember actually you visited me in Thailand after you had been there, and you were telling me about some of the things the guide told you, and it was just absolutely horrific.
It's a place that I would encourage everybody to go to, just so that you can't forget the feeling about when you were there. But it's definitely not a fun day out.
Yeah. So, Chris, to wrap this up before the story, the article that we're going to read,
Yes.
a spokesperson at Newcastle City Council told the Chronicle that they were sceptical that the remains were those of witches, but said they would perform their own investigation, which, Chris, could be a future deep dive episode for DSR.
Oh. Well, thank you very much for telling me this story of wizard and witchcraft and all of these things. I had no idea that these things happened on a doorstep. I mean, I of course knew about the Salem witch trials and the sort of slightly earlier witch panic that happened in the UK, but I always assumed that it was down south, not up here in the civilized north.
Yeah, well, it happened. So everyone, this Halloween, please join us around our campfire as we read to you the tale of Margaret Madison, who was hanged in Newcastle for witchcraft in 1649. The Misery of Margaret Madison, a Tale of the Tyne. One dark, dank March evening in the middle of the 17th century, Margaret Madison sat by the window of her little room in a dingy house in Pandon, reading a letter. That letter was unlaid on her lap, but how often and happily had it been read? It was the long-looked-for letter from Reuben Santon, her sailor lover, and it brought good news and glad tidings. It told her that the long probation was nearing the end, that the goal was within reach, that the reward of her constancy was at hand. And peaceful, happy Margaret sat there with a faint peach bloom on her rounded cheek and a sweet, calm light in her deep blue eyes, gazing at the waning sun, sulkily setting with a grey garniture of sky after a day of battlement with heavy clouds. She had loved Reuben from her youth, and she was no longer young. The budding days of her girlhood had long passed, the blossoms of her maidenhood had come well nigh and gone, and now she was on the seamy side of 40, unwedded, still a fresh blooming woman enough, the gentle mind making no havoc with the body, but far from the proper age of marriage. And all for him, her sailor boy, whom she had not now seen of long years, seeking fortune on the wide seas and about her own age all along. A homely, quiet couple, this to tell of, my friends, with not much electricity of love about them perhaps, but a nice picture they form for all that, in quiet neutral tints, and with no emblazonment of gorgeous sky, nothing but the serene light of a ripe autumnal day to bring out the figures thereupon. Reuben's had been the adventurous career of all who went down to the sea in ships at the time. He had entered the navy under the hapless Charles, and he was coming back under the iron rule of Cromwell, who, not long before, had cut his king's head off. He had become a seaman on one of Phineas Pett's achievements, and had gone through many trials and troubles, had been shipwrecked, and had vegetated in the then quiescent Mexico, gathering wealth among the material riches and natural products of that famed land, waiting for the safety of a Spanish galleon to reach home again. And now he was already on his way to Europe, hoping, from a continental port, to snatch an early chance of prosecuting his journey to the end. And this shortly was the news that brought rest and peace to tranquil Margaret Madison, as she sat there looking back upon the past, and onward through the vista of the future, with the bright golden sunshine in the sky beyond. Margaret Madison was a seamstress of the town of Newcastle upon Tyne, and had been an orphan for many years. Her father had been a boatman on the river, and had died a weather-beaten man, much out of the ordinary run of his fellows, leaving behind him little money and many effects, which latter was curious, and, in the end, proved disastrous to his little Margaret. When her mother left her too, Margaret felt quite alone in the house at Pandon, and removed her few household goods to an upper apartment and a loft, the former of which was the working and sleeping and eating room of the poor girl, whilst the latter was neither more nor less than a museum for her father's curiosities of perverse nature. And ugly enough many of them were in conscience, and strange to horror in the eyes of the little simple folk of the neighbourhood. But Margaret too cherished them, and had no fear. They had been her father's, he had loved them, and some of them had been her playthings in childhood. So Margaret locked them away, and oftentimes dusted them carefully, occasionally softly weeping the while at memories they recalled. And so she went on in her humble, gentle life, wooed but never won, faithful to the brave, giving a placid smile and a calm but sure denial to all men alike, rich or simple, and in whatever garb or mode they chose to approach her. And how many lovers she had, wealthy merchants a few, decent tradesfolk more, and of her own class most, some of the latter, coarse brutal fellows, I am sorry to chronicle, who had cursed her with their mouths and muttered cowardly threats through their beards. I have called our Margaret a poor girl, but you are not to think that she was in poverty, far from it. Thrifty and industrious, the nucleus of her little legacy, she was pretty well to do for one in her position, and had built up what is now called a good connection, and worked dainty garbs for ladies of repute. As well as wooden petticoats for humble patrons, but, for reasons presently to be shown, the simple seamstress had found her returns from the latter source strangely diminishing. But she was still tolerably well employed by the higher classes, doubtless because they, like her innocent self, had not yet arrived at the knowledge that she was a witch. Yes, a witch, our Margaret, the gentle and true. She had become a recruit, and was a subordinate demon in the legions of the Arch-Fiend. Margaret, who fell upon her knees and bent her brown head low upon the coverlet of her humble bed each morn and night, and whispered heartfelt prayers for the absent one, had diabolized her life, and had given the price, the renunciation of her faith, and the salvation of her soul. For the panic mania had spread up to the north, and the fear of witchcraft was abroad. The disciples of the monster Matthew Hopkins had learned author of The Discovery of Witches. His assistants and abettors were in the height of their prosperity in the profession of witch-finding, and moved from place to place, clearing localities of such vermin at a stipulated fee of 20 shillings a head. Unutterable horrors had already been accumulated, and on the heads of the hapless wretches throughout the United Kingdom, and many of them were, as our heroine, comely delicate and sensitive women. And why not? Was not the art the special province of women? Note how comparatively few were wizards. And that was not the epidemical frenzy, to a great extent, initiated by a woman, one Elizabeth of England, who first made it a crime? And further to realise how true it all was, is it not a fact that the first James of England and the 6th of Scotland elaborated the formula, and is it any the less true that his kingship curiously interrogated all the wrinkled old women within his reach as to the doings of the devil, and so gathered up the materials for his great work on demonology? Aye, and ministers of religion, learned and eloquent, of both churches, did they too recognise the damning truth and existence of witches, and preach the fulminate against the accursed from the pulpits of their expositions of the doctrine of the devil, filling pious minds with horror? Nay, as to the absolute certainty of all this, what say you the evidence of Judge Hale, wisest and best of men, who, although but a simple judge at the time, condemned witches, and Sir Thomas Browne, a learned theologian and metaphysician, who, from their lofty places, called for utter and entire extermination of the fleshy imps of Satan? Alack, it was too true. They were witches, and Margaret Madison was one of them. But then you ask, where and what were the proofs? True reader, and even if you have about you at the hand a copy of the Malus Maleficarium, or any other of the delectable literature of the day bearing on the subject, you will be doubly licensed to ask how the fell accusation applied to Margaret. Her appearance, you point out, how did that accord? Where was the old woman with the wrinkled face, the furrowed brow, the hairy lip, the gobber tooth, the squint eye, the squeaking voice, and the scolding tongue? Just so, but you may be sure that there were sufficient reasons, notwithstanding, in that enlightened age for the dreadful suspicion, and have I not just told you that many of the condemned were like as to Margaret? The dreaded accusation was first whispered at a gathering of gossiping old creatures, of much more semblance to witches, at the fireside of a sick neighbour, to whom Margaret had been kind. Margaret's mother, a good and simple soul, had been the maker of a salve, potent and efficient enough for certain sores, and with a renown of its own. Margaret had the recipe, and still made it for the benefit of the afflicted. But in a few cases of late, it was then noted the patient had died after its application. The inference was obvious. It was made of human fat, and the herbal ingredients from which it was concocted had been gathered at a certain hour of the pale moon, and dedicated to the devil. She had also a big kettle, very ugly to look at, and of great age, in which she in good truth merely boiled her porridge of a morning when the sun was mounting up on the high. But rumour had it, also poisonous, paralysing broth at the grave yawning, and a specific salve for her bath which washed away the wear and tear of the day before, and left her fresh and blooming. And now it had been found out that her father had been a wizard, albeit such had never been suspected before the advent of Hopkins, and she had inherited the art along with the symbols and vessels appropriate to the formulas and incantations of magic rites. She had hidden away dried bats, leather-winged birds of the night, a stuffed crocodile, bulbous roots of hidden and dreaded potency, uncouth-looking old books ragged and battered, an ox hoof brightly polished and silver-mounted, a snuff-box in reality, but currently a drinking cup for the witch, a lot of hairy things that no decent Christian could understand, and above all, a human skull, looking down from the rafters above with hollow eye and ghastly grin upon the whole of the diabolical paraphernalia below. No, there could be no doubt that prim Mistress Margaret Madison was an agent of the Prince of Darkness, and at night sallied forth for broomstick rides in the moonlight to attend horrid meetings of her like in darksome caves and caverns, to contrive and to compass, with Saturnalian orgies, pain and punity, storm and strife, fire and cattle plague, upon the unlucky objects of her wrath. By and by, as it was the way, the number of maligners increased, the whispers became mutterings, and the thing spread, gathering in strength and violence as it went from ear to ear, and proof accumulated upon proof, all eager to believe. And all this time Margaret sat at home, stitching at full skirts and sleeves and edging falling collars with rich lace, calm and gentle and happy too, because of the news, and ridding not of what she was waxing. The agitation grew apace. The inhabitants of Newcastle at public meeting assembled, discussed the dreadful situation, and adopted petitions of the Common Council, praying it to apprehend all such persons as were suspected of being witches, and bring them to trial. The Council, with promptitude benefiting the emergency, ordered that thanks be returned to the petitioners, and promised the best assistance. 2 sergeants of the magistracy, Thomas Sheville, one of the angry lovers of Margaret, and Cuthbert Nicholson, were forthwith dispatched to Scotland to engage a man there famous for his knowledge of witchcraft to come to Newcastle, where he should try as should brought before him, for all he should condemn as witches, and free passage back again. The witch-finder, nothing loath, with a rich harvest before him, at once took saddle, and under the escort of the sergeants in due times reached the sphere of his purificatory labours. Great excitement and activity were generated by his arrival. The bellman went through the town ringing his bell and crying to all people that would bring in any complaint against any woman for a witch they should be sent for and tried by the person appointed. This reputed witch-finder at once put himself into communication with Lieutenant Colonel Paul Hobson, Deputy Governor of Newcastle, and the authorities. He averred that he knew by their looks whether women were witches or no, and he was duly commissioned to set about his business, in conjunction with the 2 sergeants, who would act as his subordinates. Another evening, in higher weather, Margaret sat by her window in the waning light. She looked broken and careworn, for dreadful things were happening. She had little or no occupation then. The cloud of suspicion hung heavily over her head, and she had got to know of what she was accused. But first, the horror over, Margaret had become calm and dignified in her self-consciousness. She could not imagine that there was enough wickedness in the whole world to think her as such, but there was, and enough in the ugly body of Sheville, who had renewed his suit, and had again been repelled to hurry her to a dreadful death, and as he said with a diabolical sneer, to be accused was to be doomed, and Reuben had not come. As she sat this night, there came upon her the sound of hurrying feet and cursing voices on the stairs. The door was rudely thrust open, and brutal men with shovel at their head were before her. They held warrants for the apprehension of divers witches, and one of them was for Margaret. The poor creature was seized and hurried into the open. She spoke not a word, but her lips moved, and she inwardly prayed and called for Reuben. When she got into the street, she found other women there bound, waiting for their sister to be taken to the town hall. More dead than alive, Margaret was placed among them and hurried away. All reputed witches, many of them old and ugly, some younger, with our heroine, the comeliest and least witch-like of the number. And she went along, blind with horror, grief and shame. She saw not the form of man, sunburnt and bustute, and in rough attire, who stood aside the victims, who were hustled past, and then strode outwards in bewilderment at what he saw. Eager for a certain humble dwelling, and the welcome there, it was Reuben Santon come home. A night of horror for Margaret. Many of her companions were creatures fit for witches, and had all their lives served Satan, and they made their place of durance hideous with their cries, lamentations, and oaths. On the morrow they were to be brought to the presence of the Scottish witch-finder, and all would be discovered. He would proceed to search on the person of each for the signet in the ratification of infernal pact, an impressed but hidden mark, which caused its place to be forever insensible. That dreadful morrow came. Margaret had aged in the night, and grey hairs were plainly visible on her dishevelled brown locks. She stooped too, a little, and kept moaning and muttering to herself in an imbecile way, with beatings of her bosom and trembling hands. She was not nearly so prepossessing now, and those who knew her and doubted a little were shaken in their disbelief, especially when it was eagerly pointed out that she had not had her bath that morning and was coming to her natural appearance. One by one, the accused were brought before the witch-finder in the presence of the deputy governor and a few of the magistrates, and witnesses appeared in numbers. They were generally charged with having had the use and practice of evil and wicked spirits, had exercised invocations, had consulted and covenanted, had entertained, fed and rewarded such evil and wicked persons for purposes of harm and vengeance. They were enjoined, in the most solemn and awe-inspiring terms, to confess their crime, or in default to be put to the test and torture to extort the same, and the doom of death was placed before them in the most horrid forms. Some of the poor creatures confessed, some glad at once to escape from life, others because they were naturally feeble-minded beings who had brooded over witchcraft until they had become distraught and believed that they really were witches, and such were set aside as guilty persons and children of the devil, duly convicted and attained to suffer death. Those who did not confess were put upon trial by the witch-finder, who, with full authority, proceeded to apply his tests, a full idea of which in their horror cannot well be formed from any mere description. Of course there were special indictments against individuals as to the horrible fruits of their witcheries. One had stuck a farmer's cart hard and deep in the mud so that it could not be extricated. Another had caused a little boy to spit needles and pins so that he could not get to school, and one had swamped a boat in the Tyne by raising a sudden storm. Another had tormented her neighbour with grievous pain in the hip, while another had caused 2 cows to die suddenly in their brae, and had blasted their owners' crops. In fact, all had done particular deeds of darkness that had caused pain, poverty, and death among the good people of the neighbourhood. For some reason, that charge against Margaret was elaborate. She had committed heinous crimes by means of her charms, incantations, and concoctions. She was a special favourite of the evil one and his ministers, and they had obeyed her behests in inflicting racking pains and pining sickness. She gathered herbs and concocted deadly salves, and cooked mysterious broth in her kettle, and renewed her own life and destroyed the lives of others. She was the child of one who had sold himself to Satan, and had all his materials of the black art, charcoal made of burned bats, hairy calicai from the bowels of cows, and roots for her cold infusions that brought on deadly convulsions. An enchantress, sorceress, a witch. Before her turn came, she saw the horrible cruelties practiced on her unfortunate companions by the Scotch monster. She saw them stripped and shaved and stuck with pins to discover the witch's mark, wrapped in sheets and cast into the river to sink or swim, a sure test for if the river received them to its bosom they were not, and if they floated they were witches, so that when she was brought forward she was well nigh a crazy woman. And there was a crazy man as close behind the deputy governor as he could be allowed by the officials, a wild, hollow-eyed man who saw none but one in that great crowd, Margaret Madison, and when she was hauled up his face was drawn and puckered as he plucked at his beard. Many now at the supreme moment pitied Margaret, and it is put on record that one of those was Deputy Governor Hobson himself. Margaret is described by the old chronicler as being a personable and good-like woman, and when the Scot seized her, the governor said, "Surely this woman is none and need not be tried." But the Scotsman loudly said she was, and therefore he would try her. and when his cruel weapon penetrated her flesh, behold, there was no blood. And at once she was set aside as a guilty person. The deputy governor, however, was scarcely satisfied. He had known of little Margaret as a seamstress for his woman, and being a humane man, he sought to save her.
Grief and shame has done this, Sir Scott. Put her to another test. Margaret Madison, if thou art a witch, confess.
But she, being amazed, replied little. She gazed vacantly at the magistrates and muttered, "No."
Hast thou no tears?
Asked the Scot. The wan face of Margaret was pitiable as she shook her head.
A witch!
Cried the Scot. Yet the deputy governor made another attempt. He put his hand kindly on her shoulder. "Thou wert a good child, Margaret, once. Canst yet say the Lord's Prayer?" A faint colour came out through the wanness, and a smile flickered on the frozen lips. She folded her hands on her bosom, looked upwards. The witch-finder, with a muttered curse, drew back a pace.
Say it, Margaret, as we once were used to do,
cried a voice. The voice was the voice of the crazy man, who was at once buffeted and thrust aside. Margaret bent her head and listened, as the blind do when a familiar voice reaches them. "Reuben," she asked, but there was no response. This was no time for the meeting of lovers, and Reuben, bruised and bleeding, was flung to the outside by the enraged populace.
Repeat the Lord's Prayer, child,
said Colonel Hodson kindly. "Our Father," began Margaret, and then a shudder came upon her, and she shrieked aloud. The memories of long ago had filled her heart, and, but for this outburst, stifled her voice, and still there was no relief of tears. She was lost. The approved tests had condemned her. She had not bled. She had shed no tears, and she had hesitated in repeating the Lord's Prayer.
A witch,
said Scott grimly.
A witch! A witch!
yelled the people.
To the stake with the witch!
Deputy Governor Hobson drew away with sorrow in his face. It was all too true. She was a witch. As Margaret Madison was set aside as a proved witch, she was altogether mad, with a quiet, happy madness. The Lord's Prayer had made her child again, and she babbled of green fields, painted butterflies, yellow cowslips, and a little dog fan. As soon as he heard of Margaret's condemnation, the crazy man, all tattered and torn and bleeding, hurried from Newcastle into the country. He knew of but one who might have the power to avert the dreaded doom, but he fell sick of his wounds by the way, and by the time he reached the house of his friend of the past, Henry Ogle, Esquire, Margaret was dead, having been duly executed on the town moor as a witch, and her name inscribed on the parish register, with the items: paid for trying her as a witch, £1 for a grave, for a witch 60. This sad story may be fitly closed almost in the words of the old chronicler. As soon as the witch-finder had done in Newcastle, he went into Northumberland, but Henry Ogle Esquire laid hold on him, and required him bonds to answer the sessions. But he escaped to Scotland, where he was apprehended and condemned, and upon the scaffold he confessed that he had been the death of 220 women in England and Scotland for the gain of 20 shillings apiece. Long years after, a mild, grey-haired, bent old man was well known on the grounds of Kirkley. He had been cared for by his kind friends and their heirs. His name was not generally known, but it was something imagined by strangers to be Madison, from the frequency with which he mentioned it. But when he died, the name inscribed on his modest tombstone was the name of Reuben Stanton. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode, and before we go, I heard Chris has something to share.
Oh, yes. So, I thought, we've been talking about witches today. We normally deal with some quite horrific things, and today is Halloween. If you're downloading this episode on the day that it's been released, I certainly hope you are. Mm-hmm. I thought we could have something a little bit more humorous with some lovely...
Post-humorous
with some lovely skeleton jokes.
Ooh, oh God.
So, Linz, why are skeletons extremely lonely?
Because they've got no body to hang out with.
Oh, there you go. How did you guess?
Yes.
What's a skeleton's favourite food?
Ribs.
Spare ribs.
Damn it!
What do skeletons say when they leave on a boat?
When they leave on a boat? I don't know.
Bon voyage. What's a skeleton's favourite historical figure?
Oh God. I know I can get this if I just rub my two brain cells together hard enough. I don't know.
Napoleon Bonaparte. Did you know there was a skeleton who was a botanist?
No.
He grew bonsai trees. Why?
So stupid.
Ask. What do skeletons play in the school band?
Xylophone. Trombone.
Either answer's acceptable. And, why do skeletons make very poor miners?
Bone something.
They can never go deeper than 6 feet under.
Okay, that's pretty good.
Why?
Where are you getting these?
Why are... Fuck's sake. Why are skeletons considerate lovers?
Because they always have boners.
Way!
Yes!
And that's the end of that.
Why don't monsters eat ghosts?
Oh. I don't know. Why don't monsters eat ghosts?
Because they taste like sheet.
Why do you never want to work with a vampire?
Because they don't show up until after sunset.
Because they're a pain in the neck.
Mine was like a lot more deep. Okay, so there's a bunch of bats in a forest, and they can't find any blood, they can't find anything to eat, and they're all flying around, and they go, okay, let's take turns flying in a circle and see what we find. So one flies around, comes back, nothing. Another flies around, comes back, nothing. Third one flies around, come back, and he's like, I can't find shit. So the fourth one flies around, and he comes back with his face or mouth all covered in blood, and they're like, where the heck did you find food? And he says, oh, follow me. And he flies like halfway around this little circle that they've been doing. And he goes, do you see that pole over there? And they're like, yeah. And he's like, I didn't.
Where do ghosts go on vacation?
Honolulu.
Malibu.
Mine was good.
Why did the ghost starch his sheet?
I don't know.
He wanted to scare everybody stiff. What's a ghost's favourite dessert?
I don't know. Blueberry.
Ice cream.
Blueberry waffles.
What did Dracula say when the witch and the warlock started kissing?
Pricker, where art thou?
Get a broom. What room does a ghost not need in their house?
I don't know.
A living room.
That's really good.
Why don't mummies have friends?
They're too wrapped up in themselves.
Exactly.
Yes!
Where do mummies go on vacation?
I don't know.
The Dead Sea. How do vampires get around?
Batmobile. No, I don't know.
On blood vessels.
Mine was better.
What do you get when you cross a vampire and the abominable snowman?
Cold vampire.
Frostbite.
Damn it!
Why did the vampire take cold medicine?
He had the boo.
Because he was coughing.
Oh my god. He had the boo.
Why do vampires not want to become investment bankers?
I don't know.
Because they hate stakeholders.
Oh, I thought you said snake holders. I was like, what? That's really good.
What you call two witches that live together?
Broommates.
Yes.
Yes.
What's the problem with twin witches?
They, I don't know.
You never know which witch is which.